There is a city that existed for 6 months in 1893, was seen by 27 million people, and then was almost entirely demolished, and the country it left behind has never fully understood what it lost, or what it kept. The official story calls the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition a celebration, a monument to American ambition, a spectacle of architectural achievement staged on the swampy southern edge of Chicago to mark 400 years since Columbus arrived in the Americas. That version is true. It is also the least interesting version. What nobody talks about, what history textbooks leave out almost entirely, is that the White City, as visitors called it, was not just a fair. It was a working demonstration of an urban system that did not yet exist anywhere in the United States. Running water, electric streetlights on every pathway, a coordinated sewage system, buildings designed to human scale around open public plazas, a park that connected directly to the built environment rather than sitting apart from it. 27 million Americans walked through those gates between May and October of 1893. Most of them had never seen a public fountain with clean water. Most had never walked a street after dark under electric light. Most had never stood in a public space that had been designed, deliberately, carefully, so that the person standing in it felt something other than overwhelmed. They walked out of the White City and went home. And then something happened that the official history of the fair almost never discusses. They started demanding it. Before we go further, if you came here for the comfortable version of American history, this channel will disappoint you. What we do here is follow the evidence into the places the textbooks skip. If that is the history you want, subscribe now, because this video is one thread in a much longer investigation. The architect of the fair's master plan was Frederick Law Olmsted, the same man who designed Central Park in New York, the same man who had spent 30 years arguing that American cities were making their residents physically and psychologically sick. Olmsted was not brought in to decorate. He was brought in because Daniel Burnham, the fair's director of works, understood something most of his contemporaries did not. A fair that looked like a city would teach people more about what a city could be than any pamphlet, any speech, any political platform. Olmsted designed the fairgrounds around a central waterway, not for beauty, for logic. The water connected the buildings to each other and to the natural landscape of the lakefront. You could move through the fair by boat or on foot and never lose orientation. The scale of the buildings was large enough to impress and precisely calibrated enough that the spaces between them remained human. This was not an accident of taste. It was a theory, tested at full scale, in front of 27 million people. The theory was this: human beings behave differently in well-designed environments. They move more slowly. They speak more quietly. They look at each other. They stay longer than they planned. The environment changes the person, and if you can demonstrate that at scale, you have an argument that no politician can easily dismiss. Olmsted's argument worked. The evidence is in the visitor accounts, journals, letters, newspaper columns written by people who had attended. The language they used, again and again, was not the language of spectacle. It was the language of recognition. They were not describing something alien. They were describing something they had not known they were missing. Now here is what the official record skips. The fair closed in October 1893. By 1894, most of the buildings were gone. Fire took some of them. Demolition crews took the rest. The site that had housed the most ambitious urban design demonstration in American history was cleared within 18 months of the closing ceremony. The mainstream explanation is practical. The buildings were made of staff, a temporary composite of plaster and jute fiber, never intended to survive. That is true, but here is what the mainstream explanation leaves out, and what nobody talks about when they tell the story of the 1893 fair. The ideas did not get demolished. Let me give you a specific number, because specificity is where this story gets uncomfortable. Between 1893 and 1920, 23 American cities undertook what were called City Beautiful redesign plans, street widening, public park development, civic plaza construction, coordinated boulevard systems, public museum placement. Most of these plans cited the 1893 fair directly as their model. 23 cities, in 27 years. Before the fair, there was no template for American urban planning at scale. After the fair, there was one, and it was replicated across the country with a speed that has no parallel in American civic history before or since. Washington, D.C.'s National Mall as it exists today, the reflecting pool, the sightline from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, the placement of the Smithsonian Institutions along the axis, was redesigned beginning in 1902 by the Macmillan Commission. The commission's chairman was Daniel Burnham. The commission explicitly modeled its redesign on the fair's Court of Honor layout. The mall you walk today is the White City translated into permanent stone. Chicago's lakefront park system, Grant Park, the museum campus, the boulevard connecting them, came directly from the fair. The land itself was retained as public open space, specifically because the fair had demonstrated what public lakefront access could mean to a city's residents. The museum system that anchor American civic life, the Field Museum, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Art Institute of Chicago, each owes its founding logic to what the fair demonstrated about public access to knowledge. The fair had buildings dedicated to art, to science, to industry, to transportation. The argument it made, that a city owes its residents access to these things, permanently, not just for 6 months, did not dissolve when the buildings did. Pay attention here, because this is the part they genuinely do not teach in school. The 1893 fair was also the site of the first large-scale demonstration of alternating current electricity to a mass public audience. Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse powered the fair with AC current, 100,000 light bulbs. The fair consumed more electricity than the entire city of Chicago, and for the first time, ordinary Americans understood, not abstractly, not theoretically, but physically, standing in a lit plaza at night, that electricity was not a laboratory curiosity. It was infrastructure. Within a decade of the fair closing, the argument between AC and DC current was settled. American cities began systematic electrification, and the model for how a power grid serves a dense urban population was drawn almost directly from what Westinghouse had demonstrated in Chicago. The city you plug your phone into tonight exists in its current form because of 6 months of demonstration in 1893. You are somewhere right now, probably not moving. And whatever city or town is outside your window, its grid, its parks if it has them, its public institutions if it has those, carries the shadow of decisions made in response to what 27 million people saw for 6 months in Chicago. That is not a metaphor. It is a documented line of cause and effect. Here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, and where the official celebration of the fair starts to break down. The City Beautiful movement that the fair launched was not distributed equally. The plans that followed, the Washington Mall redesign, the Chicago lakefront, the civic plazas, were built in city centers, in the spaces where the wealthy and the politically connected already lived and worked. The neighborhoods where the working class lived, where immigrants lived, where Black Americans lived, received almost none of the urban redesign investment that the fair had theoretically demonstrated was possible. The fair itself was racially segregated in ways that the official history of the period sanitized for decades. Frederick Douglass attended. Ida B. Wells wrote a pamphlet, distributed outside the fair because it was not permitted inside, documenting the systematic exclusion of Black Americans from participation in the Exposition's design, construction, and exhibition. The fair demonstrated what a well-designed city could do for its residents. Then the people who controlled American cities decided which residents counted. That decision, made in the years immediately following the fair, is the actual reason the City Beautiful movement stalled, not because the ideas failed, because the ideas were selectively applied. The vision was taken from the fair and deployed in the service of the same commercial and political hierarchy that had always run American cities. Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago, the most ambitious urban design document produced in American history up to that point, was funded by the Commercial Club of Chicago. Businessmen, property owners. The plan called for lakefront access, boulevard systems, civic centers. It did not call for affordable housing. It did not call for neighborhood investment south and west of the Loop, where the city's working population actually lived. The plan that the fair made possible served the interests of the people who paid for the plan. The version of the city that 27 million Americans briefly glimpsed, democratic, scaled to human experience, built around public access and public space, never fully materialized. What materialized instead was a selective extraction of the fair's most commercially valuable ideas, deployed in service of property values and civic prestige. The truth about the 1893 World's Fair is this: it worked. The demonstration succeeded. The ideas were sound. And the people with the power to implement them implemented the parts that served them and left the rest. That is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and more persistent. It is how power works. When it encounters an idea, it cannot ignore. If you want to understand why American cities look the way they do, why some of them have the lakefront access and the civic infrastructure and the functional public space, and why most of them do not, the answer starts in Chicago in 1893. This channel investigates the gap between what the record says and what the evidence shows. If that is the investigation you want to follow, subscribe, not because the algorithm needs it, but because the next video goes further into the machinery of how American urban design was made, unmade, and selectively rebuilt. Here is the watch-through reward. The thing most people who know this fair do not know: the zoning code. American cities did not have formal land use zoning before 1916. Before that, industrial facilities, residential neighborhoods, commercial strips, slaughterhouses, all of it could legally exist next to each other. The chaos of the American industrial city was not accidental. It was the legal default. The 1893 fair was the first American environment in which zoning existed in functional form. Different zones for different uses, industrial functions hidden, residential scale amenities in public-facing areas. The experience of the fair for its visitors was the experience of a zoned environment, and they found it profoundly better than what they lived in. New York City passed the first comprehensive zoning resolution in the United States in 1916. The argument that made it politically possible was, in part, a 23-year accumulation of public memory of what the white city had felt like to walk through. The zoning code is not glamorous. It does not make documentaries. But it is the mechanism through which every decision about what gets built next to what in every American city is made. And its American origin runs through one fair, 6 months, 27 million visitors, and the specific feeling of walking through a city that had been designed to serve the person inside it. The fair was demolished. The staff crumbled. The buildings came down. But the 27 million people who walked through the gates carried something out with them that no demolition crew could touch. They had felt what a city could do. And even if they never got it, even if what the planners and the property owners and the commercial clubs gave them afterward was a diminished version, a selective extraction, a fair idea applied unfairly, they knew the gap existed. They had stood on the other side of it for 6 months. That knowledge is the most durable thing the 1893 World's Fair produced. More durable than the Palace of Fine Arts, the only major building still standing. More durable than the Olmsted landscape, most of which survived in modified form. More durable than any artifact. 27 million people knew what had been demonstrated. And the city they went home to never quite measured up again. The question the official history of the fair does not ask, and the one worth sitting with after this video ends, is whether that gap was an accident or a design. The fair showed Americans what a city built for human beings felt like. Then the people who built American cities after 1893 built something else. Was that a failure of imagination, or was it a choice? If this changed how you see the city you live in, Share it with someone who still thinks urban design is an aesthetic question rather than a political one. And if you want to know what happened when one American city tried to fully implement what the fair had demonstrated, that investigation is next. Drop a comment with the specific city you think came closest to getting it right, and closest to getting it deliberately wrong.